According to Julius Caesar, at the top of the three-tiered caste system of the ancient Celts were the Druids. To become a Druid, you had to first of all be born into the right family. Second of all, you had to study for 20 years. And during that time, you would learn the sacred verse of the Celts, which we no longer have because they had proscriptions against setting it down in writing, and the Romans probably really didn't have any incentive to preserve any of that indigenous culture. But anyway, they had to learn the sacred verse, they had to learn the history of commentary, which we've also lost. They had to learn their system of cosmology and metaphysics and everything that goes into a mythos. They took it very seriously. You also had to go to Britain and meet with the elders. In Hinduism, in order to be a Brahmin, you have to be born into the right family. And likewise, you have to memorize sacred scriptures and pass through a system of initiation before they teach you what I'm trying to illustrate now, which is the perennial philosophy, metaphysic of the one and the many and their ultimate unity. The Upanishads spell this out clearly if you have a philosophical background that allows you to read the symbology. For the ancient Hindus, that was the Vedas. You had to read all four Vedas and understand them to the extent that that was possible with something like the Rig Veda, but you had to understand them before you were even allowed to read the Upanishads. So, this stuff, as I said at the end of the last video, is difficult. I will add on to some of what I said last time, and this is still within that part 2. I'm just going to try to elaborate a couple concepts. And it seems like, judging from the feedback, people aren't really catching on. And that's, again, to be initiated into this knowledge, in historical societies, you had to go through years of indoctrination. You don't have that. We don't have that culturally, which is why I don't feel so bad just explaining this stuff in relatively rationalistic terms. But it does carry dangers, which is why this is occult knowledge, not profane knowledge. So I don't feel that bad also about making it a bit obscure. Nevertheless, for those who are interested in pursuing it, I will try to explain the basic concepts a bit better. So, why the unity of the one soul? Why do we all have the same soul? What is meant by that? Well, first we have to talk about what is our identity in the most fundamental sense. Your body changes. The matter of your body is swapped out. The form of your body changes. Your memories pass. You can imagine sci-fi thought experiments where you live 10,000 years, and over that time, all of your memories are lost and replaced by new ones. You go through entirely different personas, maybe have body parts changed out. What is the unifying factor, if we're going to talk about one? Well, Carl Jung's definition of the ego is that factor which is shared in common amongst all conscious experiences. And I would rather call that the subject of awareness. That must be the same because of the function that it carries out. It's the one thing that allows for the similarity of your experience across time, the identity of the self, without one thing that's simple to set against the many things that are complex. You wouldn't have the ability for a timeline to emerge. So not only is Kant's transcendental unity of apperception necessary, but extending that, subjectivity in its most basic sense is predicated on something absolutely unitary, absolutely simple in its nature. It is the subject of awareness. It's the center of our field of perception. It is of no fixed size. You can close your eyes and attempt to pin down how large the eye with which you perceive your mental field is. But it's not possible. It is the thing that establishes measurement. It cannot be measured. It is not like the things of the world of forms. It is the underlying predicate of them, the underlying condition of their existence. The subject of experience is the sine qua non of experience. And that subject can't be complex because in order to have complexity, you have to be able to measure difference. So if we're talking about a geometric shape, to establish what this shape is to talk about a difference in distance from the subject to the various points which constitute the identity of the shape that we're looking at. That requires some simple subject. If this did have a definite spatial extent, you know, it's not the one ego in Carl Jung's sense of the term. It's some big shape here, like this is you at the center of awareness. Immediately, the coordinate system is messed up, because where this falls, as I'm drawing it, is arbitrary. You could equally draw that across any if the actual subject of experience itself was distributed through space. It's not, because if it was, we wouldn't be able to draw any particular set of lines to the object of perception and thereby delimit its dimensionality. We wouldn't be able to say that this point is x distance away from us, or if it's this y distance away from us. In some sense, it would have to be both, because the subject would be distributed across space, and where we measure like the comparison between this and this, if this is distributed, you're going to have different possible measurements between you and the thing, the object of perception. You can't have the shape without establishing some kind of locus of perspective. Just like you can't really have velocity without a reference frame in relativistic physics. Any composite structure is going to rely, as I've said before, on some kind of transcendental unity that registers the complex entity in question intelligible. In Chris Langan's terms, there has to be a common linguistic medium, a common substrate, underlying the forms that come to us as information. There has to be something underlying to produce a unity of this. And what we'll posit is that that thing, that common substrate, is your most basic property, the sine qua non of your own existence, your subjectivity. Because if you don't have the subjectivity, you don't have union across time. You just have phenomena ununified by anything, and in that case you don't have phenomena because there's nothing to establish the particularity of their spatial properties or to group them together as constituting some kind of unit. They can't be unified unless there is a perspective to set against, a simple perspective to set against the complexity. If you want to say, you know, let's not use the spatial property, but if you want to say that the subject of awareness is like informationally complex, so this is the subject of awareness, what is it that establishes this difference for the subject? obviously, since this whole thing, which I think is impossible, but if this whole thing, this complex unit, and let's just say, okay, yeah, there's the rest of the world out there, and somehow all of this is contained in something that's aspatial, this is just like an informational map back here of the center of the origin of the grid. Okay, so there's the objective world out here. What establishes the differentiation of the content within the subject? As the subject, it has no mechanism for looking within the subject, because to look at something is to look at it through a subject, and if there's content within the subject, how do you get at it? What use does it have? And how does it affect the thing perceived? So, for me, all complex structure has to be delimited by a simplicity at the center, which is why we have the one Atman, which can only ever be simple, completely undifferentiated, absolutely one, and everything else surrounding that we take to be subjective is what we're going to call, according to the Hindu nomenclature, the jiva. Now, since this is supposed to be undifferentiated, how can it relate to this? Well, that has to do with the thought that I did express last time, but the notion is that the entire field of perception through time and space, the entirety of the causal chain of this, of the involvement of the Atman in the totality of the action of its jiva, that culminates in the one as a whole. And so is like all the sum of all jiva activity, the sum of all objective activity, the sum of Maya is at the same time its underlying predicate, that transcendental unity. So, when I say that the world is projected by Purusha, projected by the eternal man, projected by the one Atman, that is to say that everything that happens is within that mental envelope, because the Atman is not only undifferentiated and simple, it's also all-containing. It's not only an emptiness in the Buddhist sense, although that's probably not an accurate portrayal of what they actually think, but anyway, it's more a fullness in the sense of a pleroma. It's both. It's both simple and ultimately complex, and so anything that we think we're seeing as external is actually internal. Nevertheless, that's not to say that everything that we see isn't accounted for in a more real and fundamentally material sense than in naive materialism. In naive materialism, what is the inner substance of matter? We only know it as a form of our cognition. That's Kant's insight. And the Hindus were ahead of us by several thousand years on that front. But that is the form of our cognition. What is it that the materialist says is within it? What is matter in itself for the materialist? Well, what we're going to say is that every single possible thing that can be projected as happening without is something which happens as an inner temporal state of the same oneness, the same thing that you are. So everything is contained in this image of the unending creativity, the will. That provides for all form that we perceive. So, so the state of me being me right now, in this moment of time, is an act of will. So this is me right here. That's an act of will that's created without mediation through a series of cause. As in, there is a series of cause that's inherent to the structure of the willing state that I experience at the moment. But it's not the causal chain that allows for it to be created. That would be causation, not as illusion. Causation instead is the sum and substance of what it is to be me right now. The causation is my property, it's not the property of what allows me to come about. What allows me to come about is this divinity, is this absolute creativity. And anything that I'm seeing, any shape in my mind or that I perceive in the world, the inner being of that is ultimately also this and is equally created straight from this. So all things are from the first cause. No mediation is required in order to account for the creation of things. So that, like, it's idealism in the sense that anything perceived is actually happening within. Everything happens within mind. But what we perceive is better accounted for than in naive materialism, because I can say, what is the electron in itself? Oh, well, it's a willing state. Just like I'm, right now, a willing state. Every aspect of my physicality is an expression of a willing state that's taken on in an ultimately arbitrary way. The ultimate arbitration is God's arbitration to, in this moment, express the possibility of being me right now, or you right now, or absolutely everything else. So, it accounts for the matter of matter better, and also explains the limits of what we can say about it insofar as it's all recursive statements. It's always statements about mind, whatever we can talk about. That's another of Kant's prescriptions. Can't talk about the noumenon. Unless we're using Schopenhauer, where we say, yeah, we can talk about the noumenon insofar as in itself it's the same thing as will that I am. Now, Schopenhauer doesn't get to the Atman. He stops short of that. And there's a lot that he doesn't cover. But in any case, the one last, there's two more concepts I want to cover with greater detail, explain the advantage of the system, and that is in terms of, so eliminating causation as a mechanism for actual ontological unfolding, removing time as a mechanism of unfolding and placing it instead as a characteristic of the moment of who we are. So why temporal A theory instead of B? In B theory, why temporal B theory instead of A? Because in B, time is all one, it's block time. In A, time is created with a causal process. In this version, the first cause is also the whole. Everything stems from a one fundamental act of creation that's not mediated through special particular parts. It's an unbounded field of creation that gives rise to infinite complexity, and within that complexity, it's not like we're just talking about purely mystical speculation about the one. There's also implications for the relationship of things in the world, and I think physics is getting there. This is where modern physics is headed. This is what we're talking about in modern physics. The holographic principle, and I mean we in a very loose sense, but the holographic principle, the notion of information reductionism, and the Higgs field and Hilbert space, and concepts that transcend space-time and causality. Space-time and causality are seen now to be emergent properties, and this is like the same thing as Kant's basic instinct, that they are properties of the kind of thing that we are, not necessarily ontologically basic properties. Whereas the A theory of time and this view of like causation creating new realities and the source of creation as being causal, that's just hypostasizing the forms of our conception. We think in terms of causation, and so we say that's how reality comes about. But I mean, this just leads back to what's the thing that sets off the series. And so it demands like a set of initial conditions. And if the initial condition is really one, then I would argue that ultimately leads to a B theory and a perennialist view. But if it's a set of initial conditions, then that's reducible to some kind of common unity underlying the set of initial conditions. So this perennialism avoids the need for a set of initial conditions for creativity. All we posit is an unbounded field of divine activity. God is pure act. But for us, we navigate a world of potentials, and experience of those potentials are actual states in the mind of God. So that's one of the last two concepts. And then last, I'm going to be headed in the next video towards occult science, and the distinction between profane science and occult science is that profane science studies causal interaction, studies properties of the material world, giving a kind of explanatory precedence to the happenings out there, which is why out of profane science you get models of the mind as being epiphenomenal and emergent. So occult science has to do with navigating the fields of probability against which we're situated. And occult science has its white magic aspect and it has its black magic aspect. And basically, to put it in the simplest possible terms, white magic is what the Hindus talk about as yoga powers. It's a natural consequence of moving closer to the unity that we are. It's being more truthful in our attitude and not being attached to false restrictions, false limits. Black magic has to do with manipulating the state of what we perceive as the other, and so blood, like sacrificial acts and psychic influence, all of that is using, so basically black magic is using concepts from perennialism, which that's not just the school of perennialism as a philosophy, but using the eternal truths to manipulate the material world. Whereas white magic is seeking the eternal truths, and then the strictures of the material world kind of melting away as a result. And I don't want to get into that because that's properly in part 3, and that'll have to do again with transmigration, the mechanics of navigating between lifetimes, and also being nested within different hierarchies at a superordinate level. So, like, we can, the consequence will be that you can submit yourself to spiritual entities of both a benevolent and malevolent character. So it's possible to make wagers with demons and to let your guardian angel help you. It's possible to follow avatars, as the Hindus believe. It's possible to follow an Orphic figure in Greek mythology. It's possible for superordinate factors to enter into the mundane realm, and there are metaphysical justifications for that using the model that I've described. That's where we're headed. So, thank you for listening.